Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and this time I've got a full tank review for you on the Tier 7 Japanese Heavy, the Oni. The Oni is one of the most peculiar looking vehicles in World of Tanks, almost as if it was put together by a toddler with his brand new Duplo set. But that's not something that you would ever say to the face of the Oni, and that's because it is the biggest and the heaviest tank at Tier 7. Firstly, I'm going to let you know everything that you need to know about the Oni, how it stacks up compared to some of its Tier 7 counterparts. Follow it up with some ace tanker gameplay, and if you have no interest in playing this Tier 7 Japanese Heavy, I'll let you know how to take them out effectively on the battlefield. The Oni is a development of the OI, the Tier 6 Japanese Heavy tank with enhanced anti-tank capabilities. But the vehicle did only exist in blueprints, and not even a prototype was made of this vehicle. So the best way to gain a context to the Oni's stats is to compare it to other Tier 7 heavy tanks. Here we have the Oni on the left, the German Tiger, the KV-3, the T-29 and the IS. One thing that should be mentioned is that the Oni actually has a choice between two competitive guns. You can either use this 105mm gun or the 150mm gun. This 105mm gun is new for the Oni, but this is the same 150mm that you could have used on the Tier 6 OI if you wanted to. Now, while this gun does get some statistical improvements compared to when you mount it on the OI, I feel like the tank does better with this 105mm gun. So let's compare them quickly. Here is an Oni using the 105 and here is an Oni using the 150mm. The 105mm has 330 alpha damage while the 150mm has 700 alpha damage. That is fantastic. That's enough to one-shot most Tier 6 tanks and guarantee one-shot every single Tier 5. However, to be able to do this much alpha damage and be able to get the 175 DPM advantage that the 150mm has over the 105mm, you have to be able to penetrate with 121mm of penetration, which is not an easy thing to do. Whereas on the other hand, the 105mm gets 190mm of penetration, which is very healthy indeed, a lot higher than, for example, the Soviet 122mm, which only have 175mm of penetration. Also, the fact that you're able to divide up this damage between targets makes it easier for you to take out low health tanks, as your rate of fire is twice that of the 150mm, and also be able to reliably penetrate targets that you otherwise couldn't if you were using the 150mm. Now, of course, there is the argument that instead of using the AP rounds, you should use the high explosive rounds on the Oni, and that makes your DPM fantastic because your alpha damage goes up to 910, but your penetration drops even further to 75mm. And unless you're shooting at very lightly armored tanks, you're unlikely to be able to penetrate, and then your alpha damage is going to go down to about the same as the 105mm of 330 against reasonably armored targets, but because of your rate of fire disadvantage, you're going to be doing much less damage overall. Obviously, every tier that you go higher, the enemy's armor is going to become thicker, and so those one-shots become less and less frequent. Now, of course, if you're more comfortable using derp guns and you like the 150mm on the OI, then try it out on the Oni and see what's better for you. But for me personally, I'd rather use the 105mm. So how does this 105mm on the Oni stack up to the Tiger's 88, the KV-3 and the IS's 122mm and the 105mm on the T-29? Well, unfortunately, the Oni has the lowest DPM of any of those vehicles, significantly worse than the Tiger. You've got just below a T-29's level of DPM, but at least your 190mm of penetration is significantly better than the Soviet 122mm guns, and only just lower than the T-29, but 13 lower than the Tiger. The Oni has a very weird alpha damage of 330, which is 10 more than the T-29, 90 more than the Tiger, but 60 less than the 122mm that are on the Soviet Tier 7s. One thing that is crazy about the Oni, however, is that you get to carry 100 rounds of ammunition. That is more than enough to kill the enemy team, usually multiple times over, even in a bad matchup. So you're never in the situation where you run out of standard rounds, premium rounds, or high explosive rounds if you want to use them at very lightly armored opponents. So the aim time on the Oni is 3.3, which is only slightly better than the Soviet's terrible 3.4, and so much worse than the Tiger at 2.7 and the T-29 at 2.3. And you have the same accuracy as the T-29, you have the same dispersion while moving and turning the tank as the T-29, and only slightly better traverse dispersion than the T-29. That's something that will give you an idea of just how bad the aim time is on the Oni. It's truly more of a Soviet level of that 122mm gun than the 105mm aim time on the T-29. One thing that is nice about the Oni, however, is the 10 degrees of gun depression. And considering that you're such a very, very, very tall tank, it's a good thing that this tank has so much gun depression, otherwise your opponents might be able to just go up alongside you and you couldn't shoot them at all. And trust me, that can still happen with very low profile tanks. One thing that should be mentioned about the tank is that these mini turrets on the front of the vehicle, of course, not functional in World of Tanks, but they do have one purpose, and that is to annoy the hell out of you with a little blips in the gun depression, as you can see here. The gun depression dips down to 9 degrees as you go over each of those turrets, so be careful with that. The Oni is one of the slowest tanks at Tier 7 as well, with a top speed limit of 25 kilometers an hour. That's only better than the Black Prince or the 87 as an example. And it's so much worse than pretty much all of the other Tier 7 heavy tanks, apart from the Black Prince as I mentioned. It also goes very slowly backwards at 10 kilometers an hour, which means the vehicle is easily flanked by its opponents, but has a whopping horsepower of 1,200. And considering that this tank, while it is the heaviest vehicle at Tier 7, weighing over 100 tons when fully equipped, it's a damn good thing that the Oni gets that very meaty engine, as it still gives it a fairly respectable horsepower to ton ratio of nearly 12, which is only slightly worse than the Tiger and the T-29 and better than the KV-3. And when you consider that the ground resistances of this tank are better on medium terrain, much better on soft terrain, and the same as pretty much all of the other vehicles on hard terrain, that makes the Oni one of the most mobile Japanese heavy tanks apart from the Tier 5. However, be warned that the tank has very bad track traverse at 18 degrees a second. That's as bad as the KV-3 and significantly worse than all of the other vehicles. And also its turret traverse is as bad as the Tiger. 18 degrees is not very good at all. And so that means that it can take quite a while to re-engage targets that are not directly in front of you. So the Oni is the heaviest Tier 7 tank in the game, and not by a small margin, by pretty much 50%, or at least 30 tons. So you'll be happy to know that it has extremely thick frontal hull armor of 175 and very good turret armor of 200. It's only the T-29 that has better frontal turret armor, and this tank has more armor at the back of 150 than any of the other tanks do on their hull, even at the front. So are there any weak points on the Oni? Well, we can see that it's pretty much all red on the front. 175mm on the lower plate, 175mm on the upper plate. Even the tank boobs are 175 at the front, although the side of them is 150, so watch out for that. The mid plate is also 175. It's all looking pretty darn good for the Oni armor. And when we look at the front of the turret, it's 200. Some areas of the mantlet going up to 350. And the cheeks of the vehicle, as we can see here, are very well angled, and so don't bother to try and shoot those either, as the armor effectiveness is going to go up to like 240. The cupola on top of the tank is slightly weaker, however. We can see that if you hit some parts of it, that it's going to be as low as 150. But this is quite a small target and a chancy shot to take. However, when we look at the live version of these models, we can see that as you angle the armor, some parts of it are much better to shoot than others. If you're sitting completely in front of an Oni like this, you're going to need about 190mm of penetration to be able to go through its armor half the time, and pretty much 200 to 210 plus to reliably go through the frontal armor if there's no angling on it at all. You're far better to try and get the side of this tank. As we can see, it's a terrible 70mm, which is a very easy target to hit. Even when he's angling at 45 degrees like this, it still only goes up to about 145mm of effective armor. If you're using low caliber guns, don't try shooting this tank in the back. However, it is 150mm thick, and the back of the turret is also 150mm. So again, get the side and punish the side armor of the Oni. One thing that should be mentioned, and this is a real design flaw on the Japanese heavy tanks, is that the front of the vehicle is angled here. Now, fair enough, that makes it nice for when you want to push round a corner like this and not get shot here. However, it also means that when you angle the Oni as effectively as you can like this, it makes this area the easiest place to penetrate. And that's something that you can take advantage of on the Oni. If you shoot it here, it's only 185, whereas if you're shooting the front of the tank at this angle, it ranges between about 210 up to 250 millimeters of protection. But if you're playing the Oni, this is how you have to angle your tank. If you angle it any more, as we can see, the side armor now becomes weak and below the 70 degrees of angling that you need to auto ricochet. But there's a very fine line between what is correct and what is angling too little, and then your enemies can easily pen your lower plate. Thankfully, the view range on the Oni is also excellent. It's 380 meters, and not terrible like the Soviet heavy tanks that can barely spot for themselves. And on that note, I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's get stuck into some gameplay. So here we go, we're playing on Highway, and this is a dream scenario for the Oni. Now, why is it a dream? Well, a lot of the enemy tanks are tier 5, a hell of a lot of tier 6, with only 4 tier 7s on the enemy team. We are top tier, but also there's something else that's very good about this matchup, and that is that there are no self-propelled guns on the enemy team. When you are a gigantic slug of a tank, such as the Oni, you are a very easy target for the self-propelled guns, and so you are just going to hemorrhage your hit points, whereas standard tanks with their armor-piercing rounds are going to find it very hard to be able to go through the front of an Oni, especially in a matchup like this, where the highest penetration that any of the enemy tanks have, I believe, is going to be 175 millimeters of penetration by the SU-122-44. And as we just showed in the garage, you can't penetrate the front of an Oni with 175 millimeters of penetration outside of ultra-high rolls, or if they decide to fire premium ammunition. And even if they fire premium ammunition, they're going to have 217, which is only practically a 50-50 if I angle the frontal armor of the tank well. And so, don't immediately say, oh, well, he's just going to show us a replay with perfect matchmaking, because this is just the first game that I want to show you. I'm going to show you a couple of other situations for the Oni as well. But this replay is all about the fact what the Oni is capable of when it's in this kind of perfect matchmaking. And it will really allow, I think, any player to have a fantastic game as long as they put themselves in the right situation and do 50% of the right thing. So of course, where am I going to go on Highway? Well, I'm going to go into the town, and there's a tier 7 Soviet medium tank. He is going to ram me. Okay. He just rammed himself for 459, doing 55 damage to the front of my tank. But I guess that's what happens when you ram a 100-ton tank with 175 millimeters of frontal armor, right? Gosh, that guy just died in 3 shots. I'll take that 1,100 hit points away from one of their top-tier medium tanks. I was not expecting that at the start. Now there's a KV-85 on the enemy team. That is a tier 6 Soviet heavy tank. We put a big shot into his tracks, rolling for 369. We get shot in the side, but thankfully the Panzerwehr H is unable to get us. And it looks like we retracked the KV-85. I'm not sure if he used his repair kit there, or if that was just his crew doing the work. But hopefully we can finish him off. Ouch. That was a pretty brutal takedown. And a reason why I prefer the more accurate, lower aim time on this 105mm rather than using the 150mm option. As long as you can put your shots in with this tank, you still have enough DPM, and kind of like the one-shots just feel unnecessary. So here's a KV-3. That's a tier 7 Soviet heavy tank with his 122mm gun. We just bounce him. Now we're going to aim at the side of his hull armor above the tracks. That will be the weakest part to shoot right now, as he is over-angling his front. We take our 10th hit this game. We have already blocked 2,620 damage, and we put in another round into the KV-3. Unfortunately for us, we didn't aim that quite to the left enough, so we in fact hit the frontal upper plate, which was very well angled, and so we were unable to take out his vehicle. Luckily, we put our 3rd shot into him, and he puts an APCR round into our lower plate. We take another hit, this time I believe from an OI on the enemy team, or an OI experimental, sorry. And now the high explosive rounds start hitting us. We're not really having to do anything spectacular here. All we've had to do is to put our tank in front of our opponent and they can't deal with our 175 millimeters of armor, which when I angle like this, they've got even less hope of being able to deal with. The Chi-Nu decides to be cheeky and have a go at me, and he just burns up in a horrible ammo rack, that poor guy. Not today, Mr. Chi-Nu, sorry. And now we've got to deal with the Tier 6 Japanese heavy tank, the OI, on the enemy team. This vehicle has got about 150 millimeters of armor, which is not enough to deal with the 190 millimeters of penetration that we have. We bounce another one of his shells. That makes it so that we've taken 16 hits this game, 3,800 damage nearly that we have bounced from our opponents. We angle our frontal armor, we ricochet another one of his shots, and we just finish him off. Oh, well, not quite, actually, because we rolled super low there, 271 out of 330, leaving the OI on 6 hit points, but it doesn't look like it matters too much as we finish him off. So in these kind of matchups, I really do prefer using this 105mm gun. I think if we'd been using the 150mm gun, we wouldn't have been able to take out our opponents nearly as effectively. There's no way we could have penetrated that KV-3 frontally with the 150mm gun, as an example. And we put a shot into the VK3001P, doing 4,689 total damage in that barely over 5-minute engagement, when you consider that it took us about a minute to trundle up the slope with the rather poor top speed limit of the OI. Oh, that was for the Top Gun, and it just hits his tracks. Never lucky. Oh my word. Hopefully we'll get a second chance to be able to hit the MT-25, and we don't. No Top Gun for us, even though we were able to pull off nearly 4,700 damage in this top tier matchup. So, top tier Oni against no artillery, and there's like 5 or 6 tanks in front of you shooting at you. It doesn't really matter. The armor on this tank is just that darn good. Let's take a quick look at the post-game stats before we get stuck into some more gameplay. So we managed to pick up a cool-headed medal here, a high caliber, and unsurprisingly a steel wall. And what a steel wall this was. 5,070 potential damage this game, 4,400 blocked by our armor, with only 3 of 21 rounds that hit our tank penetrating us. We received 1,611 base experience points this game in a round that lasted just over 6.5 minutes, making 60,000 credits profit as well, as we didn't even need to begin to think to fire any premium rounds this round. Now, did this replay require a huge amount of skill? No, in fact, the Oni has quite a low skill cap tank. Any vehicle which requires you to rely on your armor and not on your mobility or your gun handling, enabling you to pull off snapshots, really standardizes and lowers the opportunity for the player to showcase their skill or their micro in a way to be able to impact the game. The Oni is more about where you take the tank and how you control the engagement that matters. This replay was to showcase the Oni's capabilities against equal and lower tier tanks when you aren't getting harassed by self-propelled guns. And that is a situation that you have to try and get yourself into the Oni. And I'm not talking about just praying to the matchmaker that you get into this kind of a matchup. There's quite often situations where you can try and go into a corridor when you can avoid the self-propelled guns and literally just wait for your enemies to try and wash upon you like a wave and taking them out one by one by one. So now let's see how the Oni's armor holds up in a tier 9 game. So the matchup hasn't been nearly as nice to us. Now there are a whole host of very scary tanks on the enemy team and even a self-propelled gun. There's very limited positions which I would choose to go to in the Oni on this kind of a map. I guess I would have an option to maybe try and get up here to try and avoid the artillery, alternatively get around here to avoid the artillery, or possibly try and camp in a location such as this, or try and go and fight it out in the buildings down below. However, I decided to fight it out for the mid-ridge because I feel like this is the most important location on the map. So, firstly, our armor held up quite well there against the E-75. We managed to bounce 490 damage, but now there's a WZ-120 on the enemy team. Remember, that tank, just like the E-75, has got about 249 millimeters of penetration. And so he's easily able to get through the front part of our tank, knock out our driver, and now we've got a TVP VTU that shoots us. The TVP VTU also manages to penetrate our tank. He's probably got about 200 millimeters of penetration. Very, very awkward for the Oni to be able to bounce those kind of 200+ millimeter penetration guns, especially when you think that the TVP VTU is aiming up into our lower plate. That's something you've got to be very careful of. If you try and go over a ridge line in the Oni, you make your lower plate oh so easy for your enemies to deal with. Luckily, we managed to shut down the WZ-132 there. That's a good result. He only had 5 hit points, though. Not really a worthwhile shot. But we managed to put one into the side of the VK-4502B there. And this is just a nightmare scenario for this tank. We've got artillery to worry about, and we've got a platoon of Tier 9 German heavy tanks in front of us. Luckily, they aren't really using their armor very effectively. The VK-4502 manages to put one shot into us, doing 474 damage. And the E-75 shuts us down with 406 damage received. And in that kind of a situation, you quickly realize that having 200 to 210 millimeters of effective armor on the front of your tank, no matter how well you angle it, is not going to work against tanks that have got 240 millimeters of penetration. And that's where you wish you did not have the big, thick plates that the Oni had that makes you a gigantic, easy target for the enemies to shoot. And you wish that you were in something more sleek and angled, such as a T-29, where hopefully your turret armor can manage to ricochet your opponents, or at least give you an opportunity to go hull down against them and engage them. The Oni was still able to have a reasonable game here. We did 1,000 damage to Tier 9 heavy tanks. We also put a couple of shots into some Tier 8s. It wasn't a disastrous round, but I really wanted to show this replay to put in the context of the armor. It's very useful against anything with less than 200 millimeters of penetration, hopefully 180 and less. But when your opponents start to get 225 plus, the armor is not effective at all. And you really wish you just weren't quite so big. Oh, and of course, this wouldn't be a tank review of the Oni if you didn't see what self-propelled guns' capabilities were like against this gigantic, fat Japanese armor. So I'm a top-tier heavy tank, and I've been hiding for most of the game behind here because I didn't want to get shot by the S-51 or the FB-304 on the enemy team. However, I don't feel like I can afford to do that any longer. I want to have the impact in the game that I can. So I take my first hit, 106 damage of high explosive rounds. I come around the corner and I manage to spot the OI on the enemy team. I put a good shot into him, and he ricochets off me for 700 damage. However, I just take an artillery splash for 1,009, followed up by another artillery hit for 97, followed up by another one for 144. In fact, there must be a tank firing high explosive rounds over there at me. We take another high explosive hit, this time definitely from the FB-304, and we get finished off by a T-34-85 on the enemy team, who is firing high explosive rounds at us as well. So here we can see just how well the very thick armor of the Oni holds up to high explosive rounds. The first round from the S-51, that is a Tier 7 Soviet self-propelled gun, did 1,009 damage. That is 2/3 of our hit points ripped away from us. And that's because I believe he managed to splash around here, near the weak side armor of the tank, or alternatively, maybe he lobbed one underneath me and splashed up there. Next, we took 97 damage, I believe, from a high explosive round from the T-34-85 on the enemy team, followed up by 144 and 136 damage from the FB-304. And did you see how quickly and accurately that tank was hitting us? How can you miss such a gigantic, large Japanese target? It's almost impossible to miss this tank in an FB-304 unless you're a terrible player. And then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was that 58 damage high explosive round from the T-34-85 again. Artillery certainly is the nemesis of the Oni, and if it wasn't for self-propelled guns, we would see this tank pretty much dominating every single Tier 7 matchup that it got into. Its frontal armor is just that strong, and this 105mm main armament is able to rip apart all equal and lower tiered tanks by just penetrating them frontally in the hull armor, or mostly in the turret. And so artillery is something that you're always going to have to be absolutely terrified of in the Oni. And so this kind of hot and cold matchmaking that you can get in the Oni can be intensely frustrating, and I think that it's something that's been truly wrong with the tank design through the Japanese heavy line. And that is that their spread is just too darn high. These tanks are either just absolutely incredibly overpowered and hugely influential when they're top tier and they don't get focused by either premium rounds, self-propelled guns, or maybe the higher tier tank destroyers. They just simply dominate. But anytime there is a self-propelled gun on the enemy team that wants to focus them, or maybe there's just a player that knows how strong they are and wants to take them out with a premium round, then they feel incredibly frustrating and useless. Nevertheless, the tier 7 Japanese heavy tank, the Oni, is an absolute bruiser, and I think it's one of the highlights of the Japanese heavy line. That if you want to bounce a hell of a lot of shots and just feel that some opponents on the enemy team stand absolutely no chance against you, then this is the tank for you. But for a more advanced player who wants to have more of an impact in every round that they play and be able to carry more situations, I might recommend to go for something more like the T29. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this tank review, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please do consider giving this a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And also, I've got so much great gameplay in the Oni that I'm going to be doing a supplementary video with another couple of ace tankers that I'm going to be releasing tomorrow. But if you're watching this video at a later date, then simply click through up here or use that more info icon in the top right hand corner of your screen to see more of the capabilities of the tier 7 Japanese heavy tank. And let me know in the comments down below what you think about the Oni, and do you agree with me about the spread of the Japanese heavy tanks, that they either feel completely overpowered or in the wrong matchup / wrong tank balance, kind of useless. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.